Hello from the AICPA and SEMA. This is the Go Beyond Disruption podcast, where we share insights from inside the accounting and finance profession that helps you stay ahead of the curve, whatever sector you work in. I'm Kyle Hannon, and our guest this week is Natalie Nixon. Natalie is currently creativity strategist and president of Figure 8 Thinking LLC, and she'll be talking to us about design thinking, about strategy and change management, and we'll be finding out why creativity should be a core competency for the future of work, which is why we've called this episode Creativity is Your Business Innovation Engine. At the moment, I'm sitting in the AICPA and SEMA head office in London's financial district. Natalie is much further away. In fact, Natalie, where are you joining us from?
Hi, hello. I am in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the United States, where it is a snowy morning.
So just as well, we've called you indoors, not out skating. I did mention briefly that you are currently creativity strategist, president of Figure 8 Thinking, but that's just a brief introduction. I must have left lots out. What else are you working on? How does it connect with the accounting and finance profession?
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be talking to all the members at AICPA. As a creativity strategist, I like to say that I advise leaders and organizations on how to become much more dynamic versions of themselves. And I do that by helping them to shift business models, innovate their business models, and develop much more customer-facing products and services. One of the big things that I've been working on furiously since the summer is my newest book, which is called The Creativity Leap. And that subtitle is Unleash Curiosity, Improvisation, and Intuition at Work. And that will be published by Barrett Kohler and will be released in June of 2020. So I'm really excited about that book.
So plug us into your world for a minute. When you're not prepping your next book, what does your typical 9 to 5 look like? Give us a sense of the sector, the types of clients you engage with, and the pivot points that you work with them to typically focus on.
One of the things that I love about my work, it is incredibly varied. I have really 3 verticals to my business. One is the longer term consulting projects where I tend to serve in a strategic advisory role on a lot of change management issues. I'm pretty agnostic in terms of the sectors with whom I'm working. I've been working with the healthcare industry, consumer products goods, also large foundations in the nonprofit sector, which are certainly feeling the constraints of new revenue models that they have to look at. So I would say there are in the consulting world that I engage in, there are 2 basic questions that I typically get invited in to help on. One is, we have way too many silos and we have to work in a more collaborative way. Can you help us? And the second is, we are part of a legacy sector, or we have these legacy systems in place and new upstarts are eating our lunch. Can you help us? So those tend to be the 2 starting points that I am invited to help clients with. The second vertical of my business is in workshops and training. So I've done workshops and training for Comcast, for VaynerMedia, for Bloomberg. So it's pretty diverse. That often converts into the longer term consulting. I caution my clients to not stop at the feel good catalyst that a workshop gives, because if you really want to understand how to execute and implement the findings, it's best to have, at least a 3-month engagement afterward. And then I do a lot of speaking and writing, and I speak around the world, and I love to speak because for me, as a former professor, it's kind of another way of spreading ideas and sharing ideas, and I really enjoy the immediate feedback that I get from audiences.
Fascinating. And you did mention being a former professor, and I'm going to ask you how you got from that to where you are today. I'll do that in a few minutes, but I want to switch focus to today and why you've joined us on this podcast, because we've called this episode Creativity is Your Business Innovation Engine. So give me a sense of why this is worth looking at. What's the main disruption here?
Well, what I have been observing in my corporate client work is that people are kind of dying a slow death at work because they're not actually being invited to bring their full human selves to work. Everyone is in pursuit of innovation, but in my view, we are all talking around each other when we put out that word innovation, we kind of mean different things. And so I believe we have to pause and actually take a step back, because the step back is to start with creativity. Creativity is the engine for innovation. The challenge, however, is that people don't embrace creativity because they don't really understand what it is, right? People tend to silo and ghettoize creativity in the arts. So if I were to say to a lot of people, are you creative? Quite a few would answer no, because they are assuming that creativity is what musicians do and dancers and painters do. But to be human is to be hardwired to be creative. So to be an incredible attorney, plumber, scientist, you must be incredibly creative. So that's where I like to start. And I've developed a couple of models to help people engage with creativity in a much more accessible way.
I think that's very interesting, because when you ask someone if they're creative and they're saying no, what you'll often hear them answer is a question they've thought they've been asked. And the question is, are you arty? That, as you say, is not what you've asked. So there's a lot more relevance in the question and the importance of creativity in what's a non-arty sector, which is finance, which is business, which is accounting, for example. So that's really interesting. And you said that the big model is slowly falling apart, and that's happening right across all sorts of sectors, workspaces, health system, higher education, transport, etc. But with all of this to look at in the future, I want to take you back to something you mentioned recently in the past, having been a professor. What originally sparked your interest in creativity and business? I mean, how did you get from being a professor to where you are now in your career?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, hindsight is 2020, and I often say that I have a very loopy background, which it is objectively a loopy background. But with 2020 hindsight perspective, I understand now that I was kind of seamlessly making my way towards this end of launching figure eight thinking. So my background is in anthropology and fashion. I worked in the fashion industry as an entrepreneurial hat designer, and then later worked for a global sourcing firm, a division of the Limited brands, and it ended up living and working in Colombo, Sri Lanka, and Porto, Portugal, basically making bras and panties for the Victoria's Secret line. I then got tired of being in different time zones from my family in the States, and through a series of informational interviews, I got invited to become a professor at Philadelphia University, which has now become Jefferson University. I was a professor for 16 years, and for the first 10 of those 16 years, I taught the business of fashion. I taught fashion management. The last 6 of those 16 years, I founded and co-developed the Strategic Design MBA program. And that was really an outgrowth of a professional venture I had done. I naively decided to earn a PhD while working full time. And I did that in the field of design management. It totally blew my mind in a really positive way. And I started chirping to leaders at the university that we should be doing something in this space. So as what often happens in organizations, they said, great, you do it. So I created the Strategic Design MBA program. It was an executive MBA program that integrated design thinking into how these working professionals were learning strategy and financial models and operations and marketing and branding. And I, about a year after I launched the program, I did a TEDx Philadelphia talk, which was really around this idea that the future of work is jazz. It was an extension of my doctoral studies about how if you are an improvisational organization, you will actually be more innovative. That led to a lot of invitations to come into companies and give workshops and talks about what that TEDx Philadelphia talk had been about. So I looked up a year later, and my husband, who's an attorney and very much a planner, said, Nat, you should formalize this. And with his encouragement, I created figure eight thinking. So figure eight thinking is really an outgrowth of my academic practice of seeing the value of having a much more human-centered, integrative approach, bridging design and strategy, creativity and business. And now, since I resigned from academia in 2017, I get to do this all the time and help, like I said earlier, a range of sectors figure out how to apply creativity in really strategic ways to creatively disrupt their business models, how their culture is emerging and evolving, and how they are best serving their own clients.
That really deserves to be on a T-shirt, because when you said the future of work is jazz, I remember, because I'm a big jazz fan, you would always hear jazz musicians saying that, you can't do jazz unless you're prepared to put in the hard work. These days you can't work unless you're prepared to put in some hard creativity. And it is hard for many people because they don't see themselves as creatives. But I think it's a good opportunity for us to talk about exactly what that creativity is, because you said it's not necessarily what people think it is. So we've talked about your origins, which has brought us to an understanding of where you are today. So let's go from origins to definitions, and let's define creativity. Fortunately, you are the perfect person to do that. So, Natalie, what is creativity?
Yeah, so I've spent quite a bit of time and research and thought about this, and I define creativity as your ability to toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems and to ultimately create novel value. So it's this navigation, this toggling back and forth between wonder and rigor to solve problems. So what is wonder? Well, Socrates was known to having said that wonder is the beginning of wisdom. And then I also like to reference a Jewish theologian and civil rights activist named Abraham Heschel, who wrote that wisdom, not doubt, is the root of knowledge. So wonder, as I define it, it's awe, it's audacity, it's pausing and dreaming and daydreaming and asking humongous, ridiculous, blue sky what if questions. Rigor is deep skill, time on task, practice, intentionality. Leonardo da Vinci, the Renaissance man, the original Renaissance man, is credited for having said that any obstacle can be destroyed through rigor. So I think it's really important to keep those two tenets in mind, wonder and rigor, when we think about creativity, because creativity is not doing whatever you feel like. It's not pulling something randomly out of your armpit, right? And when we have ghettoized creativity in the arts, that's not fair to artists, and it's not beneficial to our society at large. There is a constant ebb and flow between the wondrousness that creativity needs and also the rigor. And what I find in a lot of my clients when I first start working with them is that there's a lot of rigor in place, right? There are meetings, there's procedure, there are rule books, but rigor cannot be sustained without wonder. And that goes back to my original comment that people are kind of dying a slow death. The other corollary to saying that rigor cannot be sustained without wonder is that wonder is found in the midst of rigor. So how often have you been doing a god-awful, tedious task like, balancing a checkbook or we don't balance checkbooks anymore, but, going through an Excel sheet or, figuring out your accounts payable, accounts receivable, weeding in the garden, whatever the tedious task is, how often do you find that that's when the spark of wonder emerges? And then I'll just end by saying the other extension of how I help people to build in creativity into their everyday practice is that there are 3 habits to cultivate, and those are inquiry, improvisation, and intuition. And I call those the 3 I's.
We know that human intelligence, whether that's in the way that we deal with people, the way that we lead, is more and more important as technology becomes more pervasive and more disruptive. And here on the podcast, we try to focus as much as we can on keeping the human in the loop, so to speak. And I think this type of conversation ties very nicely into helping us understand why something like creativity is so important. We feel that, we recognize it when we're around it, we get inspired by it. We have to go back to the rigour, don't we? I mean, what is the data? What's the research that supports this perspective? What can we look at that gives us facts and figures that explains why creativity is actually an essential foundational element for this period of disruption?
The main thing to be reminded of is that creativity is a productivity play. Creativity is not some foo-foo, frilly, woo-woo add-on that doesn't have, as I said, the rigour. It absolutely requires rigour. We see that it's most evident when we look at, for example, a modern dance performance. The rigour is evident in the physicality of their bodies and the movement, or Yo-Yo Ma playing the cello, right? We see the rigour there. So creativity absolutely contributes to the productivity of an organization. It contributes to employee engagement. Our bodies, the scientific research shows that our bodies are hardwired to be creative. There's actually something in all of our bodies called the vagus nerve. That's VAGUS. It's a nerve that extends from our brains down through our hearts into our guts. We know that now, because of that type of physiology, there is a direct connection between mind, heart, and gut. So when we think about intuition, we are hardwired to really think on our feet, to follow our gut, right? And also, there's a friend of mine, Baldur Onaheim, who is a neuroscientist who studies creativity, and research like his and others shows that we absolutely have to toggle back and forth between the frontal lobe, where there's the more direct laser focus work that happens, and then the side and side lobes and the deeper dimensions of our brains, which is where the kind of sparking happens between the deep focus and the wandering that we allow our brains to do. So what's interesting is that when we think about the fourth industrial revolution and the future of work, where technology will be ubiquitous, where basic tasks will be replaced with robots and automation, algorithms will still need humans to ask and frame a better question. So for all of those reasons, it is essential that we cultivate and up the ante in human creativity.
Almost as though creativity will be the new competitive advantage, I suppose, in this fourth industrial revolution you were talking about. But is it guaranteed to be that way? I know earlier you and I were talking, and you mentioned that there were two competing narratives for the new world ahead. So what are they?
Before I talk about those two competing narratives, one of the things that has to shift is the way, and I can speak specifically to the United States, things have to shift in our educational system, where we have a pipeline of producing thinking that errs on the side of rationality, that errs on the side of the predictive, instead of falling in love with the problem, falling in love with the process. So that's one place where it has to start in order to be guaranteed a bit more that we embrace and engage in creativity. But the two competing narratives that you and I discussed were, when we think about the future of work, one narrative is a very dystopian vision of the future of work, one where, run for the hills, the robots are taking over, and it's a very kind of drab vision of a future where humans are increasingly irrelevant, and it's quite depressing. The other narrative is a more utopian narrative, which is one that kind of paints a picture of, there's nothing to worry about. Only a few jobs will be lost. We will rebound easily, and we'll live in harmony with all of this budding technology. Well, the truth is probably somewhere really in the middle. Galit Ariel, who is an expert in augmented augmented reality likes to call it a heterotopia, where we will have a hybrid vision where in the best case scenario, technology will hopefully amplify what is uniquely human instead of, as in the past industrial revolutions, where humans have had to merge into the technology.
I love the sound of flexibility in future visions, because one can always turn around and go, well, only one thing's going to happen. And then you've got someone taking the diametrically opposed view. But we know that most of the real interesting stuff happens somewhere in the middle. But of course, everyone has a different idea of what that middle point actually is. So when you're working with clients or presenting these ideas at conferences or seminars, I'm sure there's a variety of things that catch your audience's attention. So give us a sense of the common questions that you'll get about the importance of creativity and its relevance in the business world.
So some of it stems from what I mentioned earlier in terms of those top two questions about how do we break down silos to be more collaborative, because we know that cognitive thought diversity is one of the crucial things that organizations need to build in order to spark creativity. Because if we have teams that are made of people who have the same training, the same skill set, they will keep asking the same questions. And innovation depends on how diverse the inputs are. I like to say that the more diverse the inputs, the more innovative the output. So that's one question I get a lot. And the other, as I've mentioned before, is changing legacy mindsets. How do we make those changes? And I always take them back to really examining their onboarding and their hiring practices. So how are you designing interview processes to be more creative? How are you ensuring that you are not asking the same questions yourself, so that you begin to surface new types of skill sets, people who will show up very differently? I've been citing a lot of references in our popular culture where we're seeing cognitive diversity really becoming a reality and a desirable reality. So, for example, there's a hit television show in the States called Billions, and it's about a very aggressive testosterone-driven, what would we call it, venture capital firm. And at the C-suite level, there is a character named Wendy Rhodes, who's a psychologist who is helping these really aggressive, charged VCs think about their inner child and envision and visualize a future state. So I bring up that example to show that we are seeing more indicators of very traditional businesses like finance, which, this show is based on the financial services industry, really realizing they have to incorporate different mindsets, different skill sets in order to get to more creative and innovative outcomes.
So I think there's plenty more that we could be digging into very soon, and I think we will, because I've got some questions about some case studies. You talked about innovative outcomes, so how does a business put these ideas into practice? We'll be talking about that shortly as we discuss some more practical steps to turn these disruptions into opportunities using creativity as the heart of a business's innovation engine. For anyone who may have been keen to explore more about this topic, coming up at the end of the podcast, we'll be giving you links to some more resources, links, and other information which you'll find in the show notes to this episode. And if you want to view those, just click on the episode's info icon. You'll find that in the podcast app that you're using on your smartphone or tablet. You can also open this episode in your computer's web browser, and you'll see all the notes there. And of course, two other websites we'd recommend if you're interested in taking this further: aicpastore.com/go-beyond-disruption or cgmastore.com/go-beyond-disruption. You'll find courses, webinars, and plenty of other professional development resources that help you keep ahead of the curve. This is the Go Beyond Disruption podcast. It's brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. You can find out more about this podcast at gobeyonddisruption.com. Also, subscribe there, get all new episodes absolutely free. You can either have a look at the latest ones or go through the archive. We've got almost 100 episodes up there right now. Talking of what we're doing right now, I am talking to Natalie Nixon. She is the creativity strategist and the president of Figure 8 Thinking LLC. And Natalie is talking to us about design thinking, strategy and change management. We are finding out why creativity should be a core competency for the future of work. So Natalie, take us a bit deeper. Let's look at some case studies. Can you give us some examples of well-known organizations that have taken steps to be more creative and have used that to create new paths for themselves as businesses?
Yes, absolutely. One example is the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. So in every meeting around every property around the world, when teams do their daily lineups, they review Mr. BIVs, which is an acronym which stands for mistakes, revisions, breakdowns, inefficiencies, and variations. And what that begins to do is it really does allow for an embrace of mistakes. There's a lot of organizations that like to say, oh, we embrace mistakes, no problem. But let's face it, people have a bit of reticence of really admitting a mistake, a mishap, because, there could be a severe penalty for that, i.e. you could be fired. But what this does on an incremental basis is it really encourages experimentation. It encourages collaborative problem solving across the properties around the world. So the Ritz-Carlton is one great example of having designed a process and a system to help you become more creative, because creativity does mean you will trip over yourself. It does mean that it will not be perfect the first time out the gate. And that's a really significant culture shift in a lot of organizations. A second example I would bring up is at PricewaterhouseCoopers, where they have really tried to walk the talk. So as they are advising their own clients about the need to upskill and reskill, they are helping their own employees identify what are the tasks in your daily work that you realize you could offload, that could, become automated. And now how will you shift and free up your time to be more creative, to engage in much more cognitive problem solving? So those are two examples I would bring up. Another that comes from my direct research, I interviewed a farmer, a husband and wife farmer team just outside of Philadelphia. They own a very small 5-acre fruit orchard, fruit farm, and farmers are the original hackers. I mean, when we talk about VUCA environments that are volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, farmers must deal with that sort of ambiguity and uncertainty every single day. It's called the earth. So their ability to hack and problem solve, in the case of Gary and Amy Mainoff, the farmers I interviewed, they have to every season figure out a new product or service to deliver to their regular and hopefully new customers. And their latest intervention is a cidery that they developed. This was after getting funded to go to travel to England and learned from other farmers in England how they produce and design cideries. And their biggest takeaway was, as much as they were enthralled about what they learned in England, at the end of the day, they had to take that learning, do a remix, apply wonder and rigor, and figure out how that cidery would make sense in New Hope, Pennsylvania. So those are three examples.
You've quoted some well-known names, Ritz-Carlton, PwC. I think this is the first time that we've ever talked about cider on the Go Beyond Disruption podcast. So I'm happy to tick that box as a first. So how does any business put these ideas into practice? You've talked about some global names. You've talked about some micro enterprises. But for any business, where should they start first? What should they change first? And is it organizationally or individually that they should start the process?
Well, the answer may not be satisfactory, but it's yes and. It's both of those things. So ultimately, these shifts are going to lead to culture change, because when we're talking about building and a capacity to hone your creativity competency, your ability to toggle between wonder and rigor, to integrate improvisation, intuition, and inquiry, it means that you have to shift mindsets, which leads to shifting behaviors, which leads fundamentally to shifting culture. And so leadership is fundamentally one of the places it starts. But when I say leadership, I'm not only talking about leaders at the top of the helm, I'm also talking about emergent leaders. I'm talking about the front of the house staff or the folks who are at the cash register who are constantly interacting with your end user, with your end consumer. These are leaders on the margins, leaders who are embedded in the organization. And we need to begin to ask their opinions, to surface what data mine from them and understand what sorts of problems are they seeing on a regular basis. So an example of one thing that you could do is you could start to create a catalog of questions and crowdsource questions instead of solutions from your teams. And it could be as mundane as a wall where people put up Post-its with new questions about better ways to learn from adjacent sectors, to learn from customers. And it could also be a really tech-intensive type of way of data mining and crowdsourcing questions. But starting to lead with questions is one shift, and it becomes a very emergent way to do that. Another second example and tip I'll give is to start with the godforsaken meeting, right? Disrupt the way you hold meetings, because meetings are an artifact of our organizational culture, and the way we lead meetings, who gets to lead meetings, where we have them, how long they are, is a really important thing to shift. So I just gave an example from the Ritz-Carlton. The Navy has had standing meetings for decades. It makes them much more succinct. More people are incorporating activity-based work and borrowing from what's being done in education now. Where in education, it's called the flipped classroom, where the homework is done in the class and it's a different type of prep that's done outside. So similarly, how could you make meetings much more active? So those are my two examples for that question.
Right. So how would they know that it's working? And once it's started to work, I mean, how would that scale across to a large enterprise with a global footprint?
Well, one thing that's very important is that metrics should not be cookie cutters. So when I work with clients, we collaboratively define what the metrics will be what will be the indicators that things are shifting. So you may want to call them KPIs. You may want to call them design principles, but metrics should be evident in a way that you know them enough so that if you trip over them, the change will be evident. And the change could be viewed on a functional, social, and emotional level. Sometimes we only want to view metrics in terms of functionality. By how much are we increasing our market share? By how much are we increasing our profitability? Are efficiencies increasing? Are we decreasing costs? So absolutely, those are very acceptable metrics. And again, they need to be customized to the organization. But other indicators and metrics are on a social level. How are people showing up to meetings? How do people feel? Consistently doing a pulse check and a temperature check on how people are feeling about showing up for meetings. What's the engagement level like? What are meetings sounding a little? Are we hearing a bit more laughter? Are they rowdier? Are they noisier? I will say that particular indicator is an example from my own career. When I was a professor, I would say for the first 10 years of my teaching, I tended to teach, I won't say so much sage on stage, but I definitely taught much more of a professorial way where it was kind of a seminar style. When I started integrating design thinking, creativity into the way I taught business students, I was less in front of the room. The way classes were structured was much more of a studio model. They were incredibly loud and rowdy, and students were learning as much from each other as they were from any, key thought leader in the front of the room. So that's what I mean by these social and emotional indicators and metrics that every organization should incorporate in addition to the functional metrics.
So let's get ahead of the curve and look at what's coming up. How would you say that finance professionals should prepare for that disruption?
Well, finance is needing to make a shift away from only rewarding for the solution, which I'm not saying you should disavow that, but build in as well rewarding for the process and rewarding for dialing everything back from the outcome. So, for example, there are two accounting professionals I interviewed for my book. One are from the firm Eisner Ampner, where they have started to build in a lot more cognitive diversity, and they've hired a very hybrid young man who has he's a CPA, but he also built in a knack and a competency for artificial intelligence and coding. So he's able to fall in love with the process and build and raise very different questions to his accounting colleagues. The other accounting friend I interviewed is Jim Caruso, who is a chief financial officer, who, in his own personal life, he is a storm chaser. And we were having conversations about how that capacity to fall in love with the mystery of a brewing storm has really also informed his ability to fall in love with the process and not only the solution. And he, by all rights, is very much an accountant's accountant. So I think in highly regulated industries like financial services, where new upstarts are certainly disrupting the financial services industry, especially in the fintech space, it's really important to make sure that you are rewarding your employees for how they are framing questions and how they are falling in love with process and not in addition to solutions.
Well, I think we've now ticked a second box. Not only did we make the very first mention of cider making on this podcast series, but I don't think we talked about storm chasing either. But now we have. All right, Natalie, before we wrap up, let's do some signposting. For anyone who'd like to find out more about the topic of creativity in business in general, perhaps about your work in particular, where would you point them? What are some resources you'd recommend? Well,
I would love to hear from all of you. You can easily find me on LinkedIn. My name is Natalie Nixon, Nixon. My website is Figure 8 Thinking, and I do have resources on my website. That's FIGURE, the number 8, and Thinking. And I've also recently developed a card game, the Wonder Rigour Discovery Deck, and that will be sold on Amazon in early 2020. So those are 3 great places to start.
And we'll put links to all of that in our show notes, including I think you've also got articles on Inc.com.
Yes.
All right. So what's one message that you'd like to leave for accounting and finance professionals that will help them go beyond disruption?
The message I'd like to leave is that I would love to see more financial services and accounting professionals integrate both wonder and rigor. And I think that they do, but I would love to see them do it in more overt ways as individuals and also as in their organizations. I often used to tell my graduate MBA students when they were, onboarding into the program that we have to remember that something like a balance sheet is telling us a story. It's a moment in time. It's a snapshot in time about choices that were made about resources. And if we think about that way of framing a pretty primary and basic and essential accounting tool, I think you can see the ways that wonder and rigor manifest in accounting. The last thing I just wanted to mention, Kyle, is I'd like to offer all listeners to this podcast, if they email me at Natalie@figure8thinking.com, a really limited opportunity for me to give their team a Wonder Rigor creativity workshop. So I just wanted to put that out there as well. They just need to reference that they were listening to this podcast.
Super. Thank you so much. I think that's a marvelous way to end our conversation today. Plenty more to explore about the topic in our show notes. Make sure that wherever you happen to be listening in the podcast app, on your smartphone, your tablets, or even in your computer's web browser, make sure you click on the info icon or open the episode. You'll see all the show notes and we'll have links to everything Natalie's talked about right there, as well as links to two other websites we'd recommend, aicpastore.com/go-beyond-disruption and cgmastore.com/go-beyond-disruption. Plenty of resources there about human intelligence, leadership, creativity, digital mindsets, and more. Well, thanks again to our guest, Natalie Nixon of figure8thinking.com, keeping us ahead of the curve when it comes to using creativity as the heart of our innovation engines that will power our businesses into 2020 and beyond. Because, of course, we are coming up to the end of 2019. The future is interesting, and it's conversations like this that make that an opportunity for everyone. So thanks again to our guest. And of course, thank you for listening to this podcast. If you've enjoyed the episode, make sure you go and share it. Tell someone about it, and you can tell us what you thought. Email us using the feedback link in our show notes, because we'd love to know what you'd like to hear more of. From our London office, I'm Kyle Hannon. We'll be back soon with more conversations that help you and your profession to go beyond disruption. Till next time. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Disruption, brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. Learn more about today's topic at aicpa-cima.com/disruption. This podcast is designed to provide illustrative information with respect to the subject matter covered and does not represent an official opinion or position of the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants or any of its subsidiaries or affiliates. It is provided with the understanding that the association, its affiliates, and subsidiaries are not engaged in rendering legal, accounting, or other professional services. If such advice or expert assistance is required, the services of a competent professional person should be sought. The association, its subsidiaries, and affiliates make no representations, warranties, or guarantees as to and assume no responsibility for the content or application of the material contained herein, and expressly disclaim all liability for such damages arising out of the use of, reference to, or reliance on such material.